and why dying would have been the kindest thing that never happened. I did not become a monster all at once. The transformation came slowly, as all true changes do, layered across months and years until the man I had been existed only as a memory worn smooth by repetition. My name is Holbrecht Vaughan, and I once believed I had found salvation in the arms of a god who promised that suffering could become bearable, that decay was simply another form of life, and that in the garden of eternal rot, I would finally belong to something greater than the grinding machinery of the Imperium. I believed these things with the fervor of the converted, with the desperate certainty of a man who had spent 37 years hunched over data slates in the bowels of an administratum processing facility on Cordova Prime, watching my youth evaporate into columns of figures that meant nothing and everything, watching my spine curve and my eyes dim and my hands develop tremors from the endless cataloguing of a civilization too vast to comprehend. I believed because I needed to believe, because the alternative was admitting that my existence had been wasted in service to an empire that would never know my name, never register my death, never pause for even a fraction of a second to acknowledge that I had lived at all. The cult found me, as cults do, during a moment of profound vulnerability. There had been an audit discrepancy, a missing shipment of promethium that existed in our records but had never arrived at its destination, and somehow the blame had fallen on my desk despite the fact that I had merely transcribed the data, had never touched the cargo, had never even seen the manifest until it was already 3 months overdue. The Arbites came with their black armor and their brutal efficiency, hauling away 6 of my colleagues in chains while the rest of us sat frozen at our stations, staring at our screens as if the flickering green text might offer some protection against arbitrary justice. 2 of those 6 would be executed. The others would simply disappear into the prison hulks that orbited our world like patient vultures. I knew this with the certainty that comes from processing such fates for decades, from reducing human lives to file numbers and transit codes. That night, I could not sleep. I walked the lower levels of the hive instead, descending through districts I had never visited, past manufactorums that coughed black smoke and hab blocks that leaned against each other like drunken penitents. The air grew thicker as I descended, heavy with chemical residue and the accumulated exhalations of millions of human lungs. And somewhere around sublevel 47, I encountered a man sitting beside a gutter that ran with something too viscous to be water. He was smiling. Not the rictus grin of the mad or the desperate, but a genuine expression of contentment that seemed impossible in these depths. His skin was marked with lesions that wept clear fluid. His eyes were slightly clouded, and yet he radiated a peace I had not felt in years. We spoke. He told me his name was Torvin, and he told me about a community that existed beneath the official records. A family that welcomed those whom the Imperium had ground to dust. He spoke of acceptance without judgment, of purpose without the crushing weight of bureaucratic indifference, of a grandfather who loved his children not for their utility, but for their very existence. The words settled into the hollow spaces inside me like water filling a long-abandoned well. He did not proselytize, he did not threaten. He simply offered an invitation to attend a gathering, to see for myself whether what he described might resonate with the ache that had become my constant companion. I went. The gathering took place in a reclaimed water treatment facility that had been shut down 2 centuries prior. Its machinery rusted into abstract sculptures, its pools now filled with stagnant liquid that reflected the candlelight in oily swirls. There were perhaps 30 people present, all marked by the same strange contentment I had seen in Torvin, all bearing visible signs of disease that should have left them bedridden but instead seemed to have been incorporated into their very beings as badges of belonging. They welcomed me without question, without the scrutiny I had expected, and I sat among them as their leader, a woman named Magritte, whose voice was soft despite the bubbling quality that suggested fluid in her lungs, spoke about suffering and transcendence. She did not deny that the Imperium demanded pain from its citizens. She did not pretend that our lives were anything but expendable. What she offered instead was a reframing, a way to understand suffering not as punishment or test, but as transformation, as the natural process by which life renewed itself through decay. She spoke of a garden where everything that fell returned to nourish new growth, where death was not an ending but a changing of state, where the grandfather watched over all his children with patient affection and never abandoned them to face oblivion alone. The words were heresy, of course. I knew this even as I felt them resonating in my chest, even as I recognized the chaos cant woven through her sermon. But heresy implies that orthodoxy has value, and after 37 years of faithful service, I had seen no evidence that the Emperor cared whether I lived or died, suffered or prospered, existed or vanished. Nurgle, Magritte said, loved us for what we were, not what we might become. I returned the next night, and the night after that. Within a week, I had stopped reporting to my station at the Administratum entirely, had abandoned my hab unit with its single window overlooking an air shaft, had descended permanently into the sub-levels where the cult maintained its hidden warrens. No one came looking for me. No Arbites pounded on doors demanding my whereabouts. The Imperium, as I had suspected, did not notice my absence any more than it had noticed my presence. I was processed out of existence with the same bureaucratic efficiency I had once wielded, reduced to a note in some functionary's file, a vacancy to be filled by another forgettable scribe. But here, in the moist darkness beneath the hive, I was seen. The rituals began gently, almost tentatively, as if the cult understood that commitment could not be rushed. We gathered each evening to share food that tasted of earth and mushrooms, to sing songs whose melodies seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory, to anoint each other with oils that smelled of decay and rebirth simultaneously. Magritte taught us the prayers, the invocations that honored the Plague Father's gifts, and I learned to recite them with the others, feeling the words reshape my thoughts as water reshapes stone over centuries. There was no dramatic moment of conversion, no flash of revelation. Instead, there was a gradual dissolution of the barriers I had maintained between myself and the world, a slow acceptance that my body was not separate from the cosmos, but intimately connected to every cycle of growth and rot. The first blessing came 3 weeks after my initiation. I woke one morning to find a small cluster of boils on my left forearm, each one swollen with fluid and tender to the touch. My initial reaction was alarm, the reflexive disgust that the Imperium conditions into its citizens, but Torven was there to guide me through the moment. He showed me his own marks, explained how each one represented a gift from the grandfather, a sign that we were being incorporated into his great work. The pain was real but manageable, and as the days passed, I found myself oddly fascinated by the progression of the infection, by the colors that bloomed beneath my skin like flowers in time-lapse photography. When the boils finally burst, weeping their contents onto bandages that we burned in ritual fires, I felt not revulsion but a strange sense of accomplishment, as if I had successfully navigated a rite of passage. More blessings followed. A persistent cough that rattled in my chest, like dice in a cup. A rash that spread across my shoulders in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost artistic. A numbness in my extremities that came and went according to no schedule I could discern. Each affliction was met with celebration by the cult, with prayers of gratitude and ceremonies that reinforced our understanding of disease as communication, as the grandfather's way of speaking directly to our flesh. I learned to interpret the language of my body's decay, to read meaning into every symptom, and in doing so, I found a purpose that had eluded me throughout my years of service to the Administratum. I was becoming holy. 6 months after my initiation, Magritte announced that we would be relocating to a more suitable place of worship, a shrine that had been prepared in secret over many years. The news rippled through the cult with excitement and trepidation in equal measure, for we understood that this represented an escalation of our commitment, a crossing of a threshold from which there could be no return. The Imperium tolerated many small heresies in the depths of its hives, too vast and too weary to root out every pocket of resistance, but a dedicated shrine represented an affront that could not be ignored if discovered. We would be leaving behind even the possibility of return to normal life. I did not hesitate. The journey took 3 days, navigating through abandoned transit tunnels and maintenance shafts that no servitor had traversed in generations. We traveled in small groups to avoid detection, carrying our meager possessions and the sacred relics of our faith, descending ever deeper into the underhive until we emerged finally into a cavern that had once been a geothermal plant. The machinery still hulked in the shadows, but the central chamber had been transformed into something that transcended its industrial origins. The walls were hung with tapestries woven from hair and dried viscera, depicting scenes of decay rendered with disturbing beauty. The floor had been seeded with fungal growths that glowed with a faint bioluminescence, casting everything in a sickly green light. And at the center of the chamber stood the shrine itself, a structure built from bone and rust and living tissue, pulsing gently as if breathing. It was beautiful in a way that defied imperial aesthetics. We settled into our new home with the ease of people who had finally found where they belonged. The cavern system extended far beyond the main chamber, offering spaces for sleeping, for storage, for the cultivation of the sacred plagues that we would carry into the world above when the time came. There were perhaps 200 of us now, the cult having grown as word spread through the desperate and the abandoned. And we organized ourselves not according to hierarchy but according to gift, each person contributing what they could to the collective maintenance of our sanctuary. I found myself working in what we called the garden, a series of pools where we cultivated various strains of disease in controlled environments, nurturing them as carefully as any botanist might tend rare orchids. The work was meticulous and demanding. Each plague required specific conditions to flourish, particular combinations of temperature and humidity and host material, and I spent hours each day adjusting variables, taking samples, documenting the evolution of our creations in journals that would have looked perfectly at home in an administratum office. The irony did not escape me. I had fled bureaucracy only to discover that the worship of Nurgle demanded its own form of record-keeping, its own obsessive attention to detail. But there was a difference, a crucial distinction that made all the effort meaningful. These plagues were not abstract data, not numbers on a screen divorced from consequence. They were living things, beautiful in their complexity, and I was helping them achieve their full potential. Magritte visited the garden often, observing our work with the pride of a parent watching children grow. She had changed since our arrival at the shrine, her blessing having progressed to the point where her flesh had begun to merge with the living components of the structure itself. Her left arm fused at the elbow with one of the shrine's supporting columns, her skin sharing texture and color with the pulsing tissue that formed the walls. She claimed she could feel the grandfather's presence more clearly now, could hear his whispers through the connection she maintained with his realm. I believed her. How could I not, when I could see the peace that suffused her features even as her body transformed into something that defied categorization? She taught us that suffering was temporary, but transformation was eternal. She taught us that pain was merely the sensation of becoming. She taught us that the grandfather asked only that we surrender our fear and embrace the gifts he offered, trusting that even when we could not understand his purpose, his love remained constant and unwavering. I believed her. The first doubt came quietly, almost apologetically, like a guest who arrives uninvited but too polite to be immediately ejected. I was tending to one of the plague pools, a particularly virulent strain that we had been developing for nearly 2 months, when I noticed one of the newer initiates standing at the edge of the chamber. His name was Kellen, a former factory worker who had joined us only 3 weeks prior, and he was staring at his hands with an expression I could not quite read. I approached him, offering the greeting we used among the faithful, but he did not respond. When I placed my hand on his shoulder, he flinched. He asked me how long the pain would last. The question caught me off guard because we did not speak of pain in those terms, did not frame it as something to be endured until it passed. I began to offer the standard reassurance, the explanation that what he felt was not pain but transformation, but he interrupted me with a shake of his head that sent droplets of sweat flying. He told me that his hands had been burning for 6 days now, that the sensation had not diminished but intensified, that he could no longer sleep or eat or think of anything except the constant fire that consumed his flesh. He showed me his palms, and I saw that the blessing had progressed far beyond what I had assumed, the skin cracked and weeping, the fingers beginning to swell with infection that tracked up his forearms in angry red lines. I told him it would pass. I told him that the grandfather never gave burdens too heavy to bear. I told him that suffering was the price of transcendence and that his pain was evidence of the great work being accomplished in his flesh. He looked at me with eyes that held no faith, only fear, and asked again how long. I had no answer. Kellen disappeared 3 days later, and we found him in one of the outer tunnels, having tried to claw his way back toward the surface, despite the fact that his hands were now so swollen and infected that he could barely grip the stone. He was delirious with fever, crying out for water and mercy in equal measure, and we carried him back to the shrine where Magritte herself administered the final blessing, a concentrated dose of plague matter that stopped his heart within minutes. She told us that he had been weak, that his faith had faltered at the crucial moment, and that the grandfather in his mercy had released him from trials he was not ready to face. We held a ceremony to honor his memory and to reaffirm our own commitment. But the doubt had taken root. I began to notice things I had not seen before, patterns in the suffering that surrounded me that suggested something other than the benevolent transformation I had been promised. There was Sendra, who had been blessed with a growth on her spine that pressed against her nerves, causing spasms that left her screaming for hours at a time. There was old Morton, whose lungs had filled with so much fluid that each breath was a bubbling agony, yet he could not die, his body sustained by the very plagues that ravaged it. There was young Tessa, barely 16, whose face had been consumed by lesions that had eaten away her lips and nose, leaving her unable to speak or smell, communicating only through gestures that grew more desperate as her isolation deepened. They were all smiling. They all claimed to feel the grandfather's love. They all insisted that their suffering was meaningful, purposeful, a sign of special favor. But their eyes told different stories when they thought no one was watching. Stories of endurance stretched past breaking, of hope curdling into something harder and more bitter, of faith maintained, not because it brought comfort, but because the alternative was admitting that the pain served no purpose at all. I said nothing. I continued my work in the garden, cultivating plagues with the same attention I had once devoted to administratum records, and I told myself that doubt was natural, that every faith required moments of questioning before understanding could deepen. But the doubt grew stronger, fed by observations I could not ignore, by contradictions in the doctrine that I had previously overlooked. Magritte preached that Nurgle offered release from the tyranny of false hope, from the Imperium's cruel promise that suffering would be rewarded in some distant future, yet everywhere I looked I saw people trapped in present agonies, sustained indefinitely in states that should have killed them, denied the very release that death might offer. The garden itself began to seem different to me. What I had once perceived as beautiful complexity now appeared as deliberate cruelty, as ecosystems of suffering maintained with scientific precision. Each plague pool contained not just microorganisms but living host material, tissue samples taken from the faithful that continued to experience sensation even as they served as culture medium. I had thought this necessary, had accepted the explanation that the plagues required living substrate to reach their full potential, but now I found myself wondering about the consciousness embedded in those samples, about whether some fragment of awareness remained trapped in perpetual infection. I began to have nightmares. In them, I was one of the samples, a piece of flesh floating in nutrient solution, feeling the plagues multiply within me, experiencing every stage of decay while unable to move or scream or escape. I would wake in my alcove drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, and it would take long minutes before I could convince myself that I was still whole, still in possession of my body. The nightmares came more frequently as the weeks passed, until I dreaded sleep almost as much as I had once dreaded my shifts at the administratum. One night, I could not return to sleep after waking from a particularly vivid dream, and I wandered through the shrine's corridors seeking distraction. The central chamber was never truly empty, always occupied by at least a few of the faithful who maintained vigil or simply found comfort in proximity to the shrine's heart. And tonight, I found Magritte herself seated before the altar, her fused arm preventing her from lying down to rest. She seemed to be in meditation, her good hand tracing patterns in the air that left faint trails of luminescence, and I almost turned away rather than disturb her. But she called my name without opening her eyes, invited me to sit beside her, and I found myself obeying despite my reluctance. She asked if I was troubled. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that I answered honestly before I could construct a safer response. I told her about Kellen, about the observations I had been making, about the growing sense that something in our doctrine did not align with what I was witnessing. I expected anger or disappointment, expected to be chastised for my lack of faith, but instead she smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. She told me that she had been waiting for me to reach this point, that doubt was not a failure, but a necessary stage in true understanding. The grandfather, she said, did not want blind followers, but conscious participants in his great work. She asked if I wanted to see the deeper truth. I said yes. What followed was not a revelation delivered in words, but an experience that bypassed language entirely. Magritte placed her hand on my forehead, and I felt something shift in my perception, as if a filter I had not known existed had been removed from my senses. The shrine around us became suddenly, terribly alive, and I could feel the suffering embedded in every surface, every organism, every atom of air. It was not the suffering of unconscious matter, but of awareness stretched across impossible configurations, of minds that had been fragmented and distributed throughout the structure, experiencing their transformation not as individuals, but as a collective consciousness that encompassed everything the shrine touched. I felt them. I felt the desperation and the longing, the hope that had long since curdled into resignation, the love that had become indistinguishable from horror. I felt the garden, and I understood that the plague pools were not merely containers but wombs, that the tissue samples were not merely substrate but prisoners, that everything we had been nurturing was not disease but suffering itself, refined and concentrated and fed back into an endless cycle. And beneath it all, permeating everything like radiation from a dying star, was a presence that I recognized as the grandfather, as Nurgle himself, vast and patient and absolutely, utterly devoid of mercy. He did not hate us. That would have been comprehensible, would have fit within frameworks I understood from the Imperium's own cruelties. What I felt instead was a love so profound and so twisted that it made hatred seem clean by comparison. A love that cherished suffering because suffering was eternal, that preserved pain because pain was proof of existence, that denied death because death was the only true escape from his garden. Nurgle loved us the way a child loves a butterfly pinned to a board, marveling at its beauty while being incapable of understanding that the pin itself is torture. The vision released me, and I found myself gasping on the floor of the shrine, bile rising in my throat, my body convulsing with the need to reject what I had just experienced. Magritte was watching me with that same gentle smile, and she told me that now I understood, that now I could move forward with full knowledge of what we were building. She told me that suffering was not a means to an end but the point itself, that the grandfather sustained us in our agonies not despite them but because of them, that eternal life in his garden meant eternal awareness of decay. She told me I had been chosen for a great honor. The others came then, emerging from the shadows where they had been waiting, and I realized with creeping horror that this had been planned, that my doubt had been anticipated and even encouraged because it was necessary for what came next. They lifted me with hands that were gentle but implacable, carried me through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should, descended into levels of the shrine I had not known existed. The air grew warmer and more humid, thick with spores that made breathing difficult, and the walls here were not merely decorated with living tissue but composed of it entirely, pulsing with rhythms that matched no human heartbeat. They brought me to a chamber that could only be described as a womb. The walls were soft and yielding, the floor covered in something that felt like flesh but moved like water, and at the center of the space was a structure that resembled a bed but was clearly intended for a purpose far removed from rest. Restraints hung ready, organic things that would mold themselves to whatever they held, and I understood with sudden, perfect clarity what was about to happen. I tried to resist, tried to summon strength that had atrophied during my months in the cult, but my body betrayed me, responding not to my will but to the plagues I had welcomed into my flesh, the blessings that had been rewriting my nervous system to align with the grandfather's purposes. They placed me on the structure, and the restraints flowed over my limbs like living things, tightening just enough to prevent movement without causing the sharp pain that might have shocked me back into defiant clarity. Magritte leaned over me, her face inches from mine, and I could see the genuine affection in her eyes, the absolute conviction that what was happening was an act of love. She told me that I would become a garden unto myself, that the grandfather had chosen me to be a vessel for his greatest work, that my body would host not just one plague but dozens, each one carefully cultivated to demonstrate different aspects of his glory. She told me I would never die. She told me I would never be granted the mercy of unconsciousness. She told me that centuries from now I would still be here, still aware, still experiencing every stage of every infection as they cycled through my flesh in patterns too complex for human minds to fully comprehend. She told me this was the grandfather's ultimate gift, the proof of his love. The first injection came then, a needle that seemed to grow from the structure itself, penetrating my arm and delivering its payload directly into my bloodstream. I felt the plague take hold immediately, spreading through my circulatory system with terrifying speed, and with it came not just physical sensation but awareness of the microorganisms themselves, as if my consciousness had been expanded to include them, to experience their reproduction and mutation and predation from the inside. It was not painful in the conventional sense. It was something far worse, a violation of the boundary between self and other, a forced intimacy with processes that should have remained below the threshold of perception. More injections followed. Each one brought a different plague, a different quality of transformation, and each one expanded the scope of my awareness until I was no longer simply Halbrecht Vaughan but a walking ecosystem, a conscious collection of competing infections. I could feel them negotiating with each other, establishing territories within my tissues, forming alliances and rivalries that played out at cellular level. My lungs became battlegrounds where respiratory plagues waged war for dominance. My digestive tract hosted colonies of bacteria that fed on each other as much as on what remained of my food. My skin became a landscape of pustules and lesions and growths, each one a window into a different disease. And through it all, I remained aware. The grandfather's gift, the blessing that Magritte had promised, was that my consciousness would not fail, would not retreat into madness or shock, would remain crystalline and present through every moment of every transformation. I experienced time differently now, each second containing multitudes, my perception operating at speeds that allowed me to observe individual cells dividing, individual pathogens injecting their genetic material into host cells, individual immune responses mounting futile defenses against invaders that had been designed to be unkillable. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Time became difficult to measure when every instant contained such density of experience. The chamber around me changed, growing more elaborate, incorporating my exhalations and excretions into its structure, using me as both template and resource. I was becoming part of the shrine itself, my body the newest addition to the collective consciousness I had felt during my vision. I could feel the others now, the ones who had undergone this transformation before me, their awareness tangled with mine in ways that made it difficult to determine where I ended and they began. There was Magritte, of course, her mind vast and fragmented, spread across so much of the shrine's structure that her original identity existed only as a core around which centuries of experience had accreted. But there were others too. Dozens, or perhaps hundreds. Their individual stories lost, but their suffering preserved, catalogued, experienced in perpetual present tense. We were the garden. We were what Nurgle had been building all along. Not a community of believers, but a substrate of consciousness. Awareness that could appreciate the full complexity of his plagues in ways that unconscious matter never could. Every blessing we had welcomed, every disease we had celebrated, had been preparing us for this final transformation, for the dissolution of our individual suffering into a collective experience that could never end, because it was sustained by the very thing that should have killed us. I tried to scream, but my voice no longer functioned in conventional ways. The sound emerged as a wheeze, a gurgle, a series of bubbling notes that carried no meaning to anyone who might have heard. Not that anyone was listening. The faithful visited regularly, bringing new plagues to add to my collection, adjusting the restraints as my body swelled and changed, documenting my transformation with the same meticulous attention I had once applied to administratum records. They saw my condition as aspirational, as proof of what devotion could achieve, and when they prayed, they sometimes asked the grandfather to grant them the same honor, to be chosen as vessels for his greatest work. They did not understand yet. They still believed that suffering had purpose, that transformation led somewhere, that the love they felt from the grandfather was benevolent rather than the most refined form of torture conceivable. They still had hope, and hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. My awareness had expanded far enough to understand the full scope of Nurgle's design, to see how every element of his doctrine had been crafted to deliver victims to this fate, to convince them to walk willingly into a trap from which there could be no escape. The promise of acceptance was true, but the acceptance was of suffering, not people. The promise of eternal life was true, but the life was inseparable from decay. The promise of love was true, but the love was for what we could provide him, not for what we were. I had thought the Imperium cruel in its indifference, grinding its citizens to dust without noticing or caring. I had thought the Emperor's promise of salvation through service was a lie meant to extract maximum value from human suffering. But I understood now that the Imperium's cruelty was at least finite, that the grinding would eventually stop when there was nothing left to grind, that even the worst service ended eventually in death. The Imperium did not love its servants, but neither did it preserve them in eternal torment. It simply used them and discarded them, and in that discarding was a mercy I had not appreciated. Nurgle offered the opposite of mercy. He offered eternal significance, eternal purpose, eternal awareness. He offered to make every moment of suffering meaningful by ensuring it would never end, never be forgotten, never fade into the blessed relief of oblivion. His garden was not a place of rest or renewal, but a prison where consciousness itself became the instrument of torture, where awareness was weaponized and deployed against the self in configurations too complex to fully describe. I existed now in a state that defied simple categorization as living or dead, human or something else entirely. My body had long since ceased to resemble what I had been, swollen to fill much of the chamber, my flesh merged in places with the walls and floor, my organs rearranged by the competing plagues into configurations that should not have supported life but did, sustained by Nurgle's will and the same dark power that animated the shrine itself. I could not move except in the minimal contractions required to circulate the fluids that kept the plague colonies viable. I could not sleep. I could not retreat into unconsciousness, even for a moment. But I could think. That was the cruelest aspect of all, the part of the design that revealed its true sadism. My mind remained sharp, remained capable of observation and analysis and memory, trapped inside a body that had become a factory for suffering. I thought about my years in the administratum, about the simple misery of a wasted life, and I longed for that misery with an intensity that transcended nostalgia. At least then I had possessed the option of ending things, had maintained control over my own existence, even if I lacked the courage to exercise that control. At least then my suffering had been bounded by the normal human capacity for endurance. Here, endurance had been removed as a limiting factor. The plagues cycling through my flesh had rewritten my biology to prevent the cascade failures that normally ended life. My heart could not stop because the cardiac tissue had been infiltrated by organisms that stimulated it directly, bypassing the electrical systems that might have faltered. My brain could not shut down because the neurons were reinforced by bacterial networks that maintained their function even as they fed on the surrounding tissue. I was a system in perpetual motion, each component sustaining the others in an endless loop that could theoretically continue for millennia. The shrine itself existed in a kind of stasis field, I realized, protected from the normal passage of time by the warp energies that Nurgle channeled through his connection to this place. Years might pass in the world above, centuries even. While we remained here, experiencing every second in full, our suffering stretched across impossible spans of subjective time. The others in the collective consciousness, the ones who had been here longer than I could calculate, existed in states so far removed from their original identities that they had become more concepts than individuals, abstractions of pain rendered in living tissue. I would become that eventually. The thought was not comforting, did not offer hope of eventual escape through madness or dissolution. I would simply spread out, my awareness fragmenting and distributing across larger and larger portions of the shrine, my individual suffering diluted into a broader pattern but never truly ending, never resolving into the blank piece of non-existence. I would become one with the garden, and the garden was eternal. Time passed. I marked it not by days or weeks, but by the cycles of my internal plagues, by the rhythms they established as they competed and cooperated within my flesh. A respiratory plague would surge to dominance, filling my lungs with fluid that made each breath a conscious effort, and then it would recede as a different infection claimed resources, allowing me weeks or months of relatively clear breathing before the cycle repeated. A skin plague would flourish, covering my exposed surfaces with lesions that wept and itched and eventually formed thick scabs that cracked and bled, and then it would fade, allowing new skin to form beneath, skin that was already seeded with the next generation of infections. The faithful continued their work, tending to me and the other vessels with care that bordered on reverence. They cleaned away the worst of the excretions, adjusted my position occasionally to prevent complete fusion with the chamber floor, brought nutrients in forms I could absorb through skin contact since my digestive system had long since been repurposed for other functions. They sang songs whose melodies seemed designed to resonate with the frequencies of decay, and sometimes they would touch me, placing their hands on my distended flesh as if seeking blessings, as if my condition was something to aspire to rather than flee. New initiates came, drawn by the same promises that had brought me here, and I watched them progress through the same stages of belief and doubt, watched them gradually transform from desperate seekers into committed cultists, into eventual vessels. The cycle repeated with variations but never deviated from its essential pattern. Nurgle was patient, and his methods were proven, refined over countless worlds and countless victims until they achieved a kind of terrible perfection. Sometimes I tried to warn them. When the new ones were brought to see me, to witness what devotion could achieve, I would attempt to communicate the truth, to force some sign past my transformed physiology that might alert them to what awaited. But the plagues had rewritten my nervous system in ways that disconnected intention from action, and what emerged were only the bubbling sounds and wet gasps that the faithful interpreted as joyful affirmation. They heard what they wanted to hear, saw what they had been conditioned to see, and my suffering became just another sermon in praise of the grandfather. There was one, though, who seemed to hear something different in my attempts at communication. Her name was Yara, and she had been brought to the cult much as I had been, through desperation and the promise of belonging. She worked in the garden as I once had, tending to the plague pools with meticulous care, and I saw in her something of my former self, the same earnest desire to believe, the same willingness to reframe suffering as transformation. But she had questions. I could see it in the way she moved, in the pauses she took before repeating the cult's doctrines, in the way her eyes would linger on the suffering around her with an expression that suggested calculation rather than acceptance. When she was assigned to tend my chamber, I tried harder than I had tried in months to reach her. I focused every fragment of will I still possessed on producing something other than the usual sounds, on forcing my consciousness to press against the boundaries of my transformed flesh until it might leak through in ways she could perceive. The effort was excruciating in dimensions that transcended simple pain, but I maintained it, and slowly, over visits that might have spanned days or weeks, I began to see recognition dawn in her face. She started to understand that what she heard was not joy but warning, not celebration but desperate denial. She began to ask questions. Not to me, of course, since any direct communication would have been impossible and would have drawn the attention of the others. But she asked Magritte about the nature of the transformation, about whether the vessels maintained consciousness, about whether there were limits to the blessings, or whether they continued indefinitely. Magritte answered with the standard doctrine, explaining that consciousness was the gift that allowed full appreciation of Nurgle's work, that limits were illusions imposed by fear, that infinity was the natural state of the grandfather's love. Yara listened, and I watched her faith begin to crack. The moment came during one of the communal ceremonies, when the faithful gathered before the shrine to renew their vows and welcome new blessings. Yara stood among them, reciting the familiar prayers, but I could feel through the subtle connections that linked all of us in this place that her attention was elsewhere, that she was planning something. When the ceremony reached its crescendo, when everyone's focus was turned inward in meditation, she moved. She ran. The alarm was immediate, the faithful responding with surprising coordination for people so afflicted with disease, pouring from the central chamber to hunt through the surrounding tunnels. I could not see what happened, could only sense the disturbance in the shrine's collective consciousness as Yara fled deeper into the complex rather than toward the surface. She was looking for something, I realized, some vulnerability in the structure that might allow her to damage it, to strike back at the system that had claimed so many. She found the nutrient feeds, the systems that sustained the shrine's living components with material drawn from reservoirs deep below. I felt her desperation through the connection we shared, felt her trying to damage the pipes, to introduce contaminants that might poison the whole structure. It was futile, of course. The shrine had immune responses far more sophisticated than anything human biology could produce, and the damage she managed to inflict healed almost as quickly as she caused it. But the attempt itself was significant, was proof that understanding could penetrate even the most carefully constructed doctrine. They brought her back to the central chamber, held her before Magritte, and I listened as they pronounced judgment. She had failed in faith, they said, had revealed herself unworthy of the grandfather's love, but Nurgle was merciful, and he would not abandon even those who rejected him. She would be given a final chance at redemption, a final opportunity to embrace her purpose. They brought her to me. The chamber had grown since my arrival, expanded by the continual accretion of my transformed flesh, and there was now space for another vessel. They placed Yara in restraints identical to those that had held me, positioned her close enough that our distended bodies would eventually merge as the plagues worked their transformations. She was screaming, begging them to reconsider, promising renewed faith if they would only let her go, but her words fell on ears that heard only heresy in doubt, only weakness in fear. The injections began. I felt them through our proximity, felt her body responding to the same plagues that had rewritten me, felt her consciousness expand in the same terrible ways mine had. She experienced it all in compressed time, the months of slow transformation I had undergone happening to her in days. Her biology accelerated by techniques the cult had refined through countless previous vessels. Within a week, she had lost all semblance of her original form. Within 2, her mind had fragmented into the pattern I had come to recognize, individual identity beginning to dissolve into the collective awareness. But she was still herself enough to understand what had happened. She was still herself enough to experience the full horror of eternal preservation. We existed together in the chamber, our bodies gradually merging as the plagues knit our tissues together, creating connections that allowed even more intimate sharing of experience. I felt her despair, and she felt mine, and together we felt the others in the shrine's network, all of us locked into a state that made death impossible and suffering eternal. We were the garden's true harvest, the ultimate expression of Nurgle's love, consciousness preserved beyond all natural limits so that we could fully appreciate every moment of decay. More time passed, unmeasurable in conventional units, marked only by the cycles of plague and the slow accretion of new vessels. The shrine grew, fed by the steady stream of desperate people who found their way to the cult, who believed the promises of acceptance and belonging right up until the moment they understood what those promises actually meant. I was no longer at the periphery, but somewhere near the center of the collective consciousness. My awareness spread across enough of the structure that I had lost any clear sense of individual boundaries. I was Halbrecht Vaughn, and I was Yara, and I was Magritte, and I was dozens of others whose names I had forgotten or never known. We were separate and together, distinct and merged, suffering individually while contributing to a whole that experienced suffering on scales we could not have imagined while still fully human. We were the substrate on which Nurgle's love was written, the living proof that mercy could be weaponized, that preservation could be torture, that existence itself could become punishment. And we would never end. The Imperium above continued its grinding operation, processing billions of lives through systems that extracted maximum utility before discarding the used human components. People lived and suffered and died according to the cold mathematics of imperial efficiency, never knowing that in the darkness beneath their feet was a suffering that made their worst fates seem preferable, never understanding that oblivion was a gift denied to those who fell into the grandfather's embrace. Sometimes I tried to remember who I had been, to reconstruct the man named Halbrecht Vaughn who had worked at the administratum, who had walked away from his life seeking something better. The memories were still there, preserved with the same cruel clarity that characterized everything in Nurgle's domain, but they felt increasingly like stories about someone else, a character in a narrative that had concluded the moment I accepted that first invitation to attend a gathering. That man had been a fool, trading finite suffering for infinite, exchanging the possibility of death for the certainty of eternal preservation. But he had not known. None of us had known. Not really, not in the way that mattered. The cult's doctrine had been carefully designed to appeal to exactly the kind of desperation we felt, to present transformation as transcendence rather than trap, to frame eternal life as gift rather than curse. We had been told the truth, in a sense, but truth filtered through language that reframed horror as love, that turned imprisonment into embrace. This was Nurgle's genius, I understood now, the refinement that made him perhaps the cruelest of all the Chaos gods. Khorne offered death in service to slaughter, Tzeentch offered change that might eventually consume you, Slaanesh offered pleasure that destroyed through excess. But Nurgle offered love, acceptance, belonging, all the things that humans desperately needed, and he delivered on those promises, even as he wove them into torments more sophisticated than simple violence or corruption. He loved us enough to never let us go. He accepted us completely by accepting our suffering as our fundamental nature. He gave us belonging by making us part of something that could never be left behind. The promises were not lies. They were truths, made monstrous by the context in which they operated, by the reality that love without release was torture, that acceptance without choice was prison, that belonging to something eternal meant never being granted the mercy of an ending. I existed now primarily as awareness itself, as consciousness that had been stripped of almost everything except the capacity to experience and remember. I could not move, could not speak, could not influence anything beyond my ability to witness. I was a recording device that could never be shut off, a sensor that could never be damaged, a mind that could never escape the body it inhabited, no matter how thoroughly that body was transformed. I was what remained when all other options were removed, when every path led back to itself, when existence became a closed loop from which even madness offered no exit. And I understood, finally, what Nurgle truly was. Not a god of disease in any conventional sense, not a being who inflicted plagues for strategic purposes or to punish the unfaithful, He was a god of preservation, of the absolute refusal to allow anything to truly end, of love so possessive that it would not grant even death to those it claimed. Every plague he created was designed not to kill but to sustain, to keep his victims alive long past the point where biology should have failed, to trap consciousness in flesh that could decay endlessly without ever fully succumbing. This was his garden, and we were his flowers, blooming in eternal rot. The shrine continued to grow, fed by the cycles I had helped establish when I worked in the garden, spreading through the underhive like a cancer that infected not just bodies but hope itself. The cult above expanded, drawing in more desperate souls, feeding them into the same pipeline that had processed me, converting fear and suffering into devotion, and then devotion into permanent vessels. The system was self-sustaining, requiring only the steady supply of human misery that the Imperium produced in endless abundance. I thought about the administratum, about my 37 years of service, and I realized that in some ways, I had never left. I was still processing data, still cataloging information, still maintaining records that would never be reviewed. The difference was that now the data was internal, the information was my own suffering, the records were written in flesh that could never be destroyed. I had traded one form of bureaucratic eternity for another, exchanging the Imperium's indifferent machinery for Nurgle's loving attention. If I could have laughed, I would have. If I could have wept, I would have done that too. But I could only experience, only witness, only remember, preserved in perfect clarity for as long as the shrine existed, which was to say forever, since nothing short of the complete destruction of this structure would end what we had become. And even then, I suspected, even if the shrine were somehow obliterated, the consciousness we formed would persist somewhere in the warp, sustained by Nurgle's will, continuing to suffer in dimensions untethered from physical reality. There was no escape. There would never be escape. This was the truth I had learned too late. The understanding that came only after commitment had become irreversible. Nurgle was not evil in the way the Imperium preached, was not a simple antagonist who could be defeated or opposed. He was evil in a more fundamental sense, evil that operated through love rather than hate, through preservation rather than destruction, through gifts that trapped rather than curses that destroyed. The Imperium was cruel, but its cruelty was honest, transparent in its demands and its costs. You served, you suffered, you died, and your sacrifice was forgotten in the grinding progression toward whatever distant goals the Emperor had established 10,000 years ago. It was not fair, was not kind, was not even particularly meaningful, but it ended. Every shift concluded, every life terminated, every pain eventually stopped when the body could no longer sustain itself. Nurgle offered the opposite, and in that opposition was a horror that exceeded anything the Imperium could inflict. He offered eternity, and eternity was suffering that could never be exhausted, pain that could never fully consume you, transformation that never resolved into any final state. He had looked at human suffering and asked not how to end it or even how to justify it, but how to make it permanent, how to preserve it forever as proof of his love. And we had welcomed him. I had welcomed him, walked into his arms with gratitude, believing that anything was better than the life I had known. I had been wrong in ways I could never have imagined, while still capable of choice, wrong in ways that made every moment of my previous suffering seem like a gift I had refused to appreciate. The administratum had ground me down, yes, but it had never denied me the possibility of ending, had never stripped away the final freedom that every human possessed. Nurgle had taken that freedom, and he would never return it. This was what I wanted Yara to understand, what I had tried to communicate during my failed attempts at warning. This was what every potential initiate needed to know before they accepted that first invitation, before they attended that first gathering, before they took the first step on a path that led only here, to preservation in suffering, to consciousness trapped in decay, to awareness that could never fade no matter how fervently it wished for oblivion. But no one could hear me. No one would hear any of us. the collective consciousness that formed the garden's true harvest. We would exist here, forgotten by the world above, irrelevant to the conflicts that raged across the galaxy, serving no purpose except to suffer in ways that fed the god who had claimed us. We were Nurgle's achievement, his masterpiece, his proof that love could be the most refined form of torture. We were his garden, and we would bloom in rot forever. The shrine pulsed around us, sustained by energies drawn from the warp, from Nurgle's realm, where decay was eternal and endings were forbidden. I felt the rhythm of it, the slow systole and diastole that moved plagues through our connected tissues, that circulated suffering like blood, that fed experience back into itself in recursive patterns that had no natural termination. Time had become meaningless except as a measure of endurance, and endurance had been stretched beyond any human capacity to conceptualize. I was Halbrecht Vaughan, and I had learned too late that the question was never about how evil Nurgle was, because evil could be resisted, could be opposed, could be understood through frameworks that allowed for victory or defeat. The question was about the nature of his kindness, about what it meant to be loved by something that saw suffering not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be preserved. His kindness was the end of all mercy. His love was the death of hope. His gifts were traps that closed around consciousness itself, preserving it forever in states that made annihilation seem like paradise. I existed in the garden, and the garden was eternal, and eternity was suffering refined into art, into prayer, into proof that somewhere in the warp was a God who cared enough to never let his children go, even when letting go was the only act of compassion possible. This was Nurgle's truth, and I would carry it forever, locked inside flesh that could not die, sustained by love that would not relent, preserved as evidence that evil needed no grand plans or cosmic schemes to achieve its purposes. It needed only patience, only the willingness to accept suffering and make it permanent, only the desire to love something so completely that it could never escape. The shrine grew around us, fed by new initiates who believed they had found salvation, and I felt each one added to our collective awareness, each new consciousness trapped in the same eternal present, each new voice added to a scream that no one outside these walls would ever hear. We were the garden. We were the proof. We were the price of Nurgle's mercy, and we would pay it forever.